My name is Lillian Usadi. I'm a Rhodes in Residence, Master's in Engineering scholar at the moment. I'm also a naval scholar, so a naval officer, so this panel is very much relevant to me, and I am deeply interested in what these panelists have to say. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to just quickly introduce our panelists, and then we can just delve right into the questions. So here on the left, we have Robert Cross. He is the CEO and founder of Adarga, a leading developer of artificial intelligence software, serving customers in defense and national security, and is formerly a British Army officer. And now we have Nick Elliott, who is the UK chair of the European Defense Technology and AI company Helsing, and also a former Army officer. On my right, we have Emelia Probasco, who is the senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technologies, where she works on the military applications of AI. She also is a former surface warfare officer in the US Navy. And on my very right, we have Chana, Professor Deeph Chana, who is the managing director of DIANA, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, and is part of NATO. Thank you so much for being here. The first question I want to ask is, what exactly is AI, and how does that relate to the work that you're doing? Seems like kind of a simple question, but in our discussions before this, it seems quite a deep and multifaceted one. I would like all the panelists to kind of briefly describe their work so everyone has more context. So if we could start with Deeph.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've had a bit of a mixed bag career over the last few years. And as you said, I'm a professor at Imperial College London. So there I've been heading up our Institute for Security Science and Technology, where we look at how disruptive technology can help us with problems of insecurity, or looking at security and defense type related issues. And I got very interested in exactly how we might be able to look at the source problems, if you like, that drive insecurity, and how we might direct our science and technology research and development to try and hit those root causes, right? And that, in one way or another, led me to become the managing director of this thing called the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. And what we're principally trying to do with this accelerator program is to find startup companies that are developing technologies, AI being one of the sort of areas that we might look at, but find technologies that can actually help us to reduce the risk of conflict scenarios from happening in the first place. And if you think of conflict as a risk with two terms, likelihood and impact, of course, what you should be in the business of doing if you're in defense or in security or anything else is trying to bring the likelihood and the impact down. And once you're in conflict, you're in the impact space, which means you need to kind of resolve it quickly and get out. And if you're smart and you don't want to get there in the first place, you try and reduce the likelihood. And so if we have science and technology that can bring down both of those, then that's kind of principally what my organization is all about. Machine learning for us is obviously a paradigm-changing kind of technology. It's something that people, I think, have heard of in the public eye just over the last 10 years, but my own research takes me back 20, 30 years working with machine learning before you could even get £1 from a research council for your funding, because it wasn't that sexy back then, because there wasn't enough data. But I think what machine learning has the opportunity to do, obviously it represents a very different way for us to program our machines and our computers through data. I'll just leave it at that without getting too technical. But the profound implications it has for us being able to either solve some of the world's biggest problems versus making them far worse. This is a choice that we have as human beings. This is where our agency lies. And I think the reason why machine learning is so interesting is because it truly has the potential to make massive impacts in both those areas.
Thank you for that. What do you think, Emelia?
I was joking with someone before that it's professionally dangerous to try and define AI for anyone who works in AI. So to your first question, I think the OECD just came out with a new definition of AI yesterday, and AI is just a bit of a concept that can then we put underneath it a whole slew of different techniques and approaches. Today, I am not in the military. I do analysis, and we use data science to look at research around the world at Georgetown CSET and try and help policymakers, decision makers understand what technologies are emerging and what their potential impacts might be. That's both through doing natural language processing on all the world's research, but also just regular analysis of purchase records or sort of what the Defense Department has bought. I came to AI as a young naval officer, working with, I was on a ship, and I had what is, some people may have heard of, the Tomahawk weapon, which back then nobody would have said it had computer vision, but now I think we'd go back and say that the way that it does what it does is with computer vision. And I got very interested in this whole notion of how do you use AI in other ways, but even more interested in the question of how do you help senior policymakers understand what this technology is and what it can and cannot do. So after that experience on a ship, I went to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where I got to work with everybody from those who were interested with counterterrorism types of tasks, to cyber types of tasks, to space exploration, and all the different ways you can apply AI across that really broad range of missions.
Thank you for that. What about you, Nick? What do you think it means to you?
Well, the first thing I think is that we're missing an Air Force officer from this panel. So Deeph, you might have to represent it, 2 ex-Army officers and 2 naval officers.
And Coast Guard as well.
And Coast Guard as
And
well,
Space
that's right.
Force.
Yeah, and
Space
Space. Space. On cyber, yeah. Sorry, missing quite a few. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be invited here today. And my 2 teenage daughters said when you come, but Dad, aren't you going to raise the average age of the audience by about 10 years? So I'm pleased to have done that as well today. And I was the UK CEO, now the UK chair of a company called Helsing. So we are a new European defence company, a new European defence tech company, and a new European defence tech AI company, founded with the vision that we need that technology to support our Western democracies because of the threats we face with the proliferation of threat and the way in which the spread of data and systems is now working. We need a company that is going to work for the good of our democratic systems to be able to provide some counter to that. And why do I say that? Well, there's been a massive convergence of information and effects from so many multiple assets that people use, be those drones, be those planes, be those ships, be those submarines, whatever they are. And all of that information is coming in at a speed and a scale which is just beyond human cognitive ability. If I give you a fact, since the human existence started, 90% of the data that exists in that time frame, 90% of it was created in the last 2 years. And of that, 80% of it's unstructured. So there's a massive opportunity to both exploit that data, but also a need to understand what that data is telling us in order to protect and serve ourselves. So if you're going to be able to process that data effectively, then you need to use solutions like AI. And we believe that defense has now become a software problem. And utilization of these technologies allow us to really transform current capabilities. You can increase speed, increase the speed of decision making, increase the speed of your effects. You can increase the precision with all of the advantages that brings, especially in things like the impact of collateral damage. You can improve the efficiency. And you can also, most importantly, integrate those thousands, tens of thousands of assets that you've got in a much more effective way. You can amplify and simplify using AI. And I think that's really important because we've struggled, certainly in the British military over the last 10 years, with trying to identify what the military of the future looks like. And certainly I was speaking to the Chief of the General Staff, who heads the British Army a while ago. And they were trying to define what the army looks like in 20 years. Well, I know 3 things about what the army looks like in the next 20 years. One is we don't know what the threat's going to be, so how can you totally define what the requirement is? The second thing is you have no idea what the technology is going to be because the pace of change is so fast and it's iterating so quickly that it's difficult to say, well, this is the technology we need in that time frame. But what I do know is that 80% of the equipment the British Army uses today, they'll still have in 20 years' time. So you've got to find a way to use AI and software and technology to improve the current systems we've got to be able to face that future. But the final thing I say is you've also got to do it in a way that recognizes that some of the things we are doing will test the way in which humans think about human control and how we want to have a person in the loop in terms of decision making with regards to how we certainly make decisions about lethal effects. So what we're developing has got to be ethical. It's got to be done in the full knowledge of how the AI works, the transparency of the decision making, so that when somebody is making the decision to use it, they understand the full implications of that. But those implications play out in different ways. If you're standing on the bridge of a ship and somebody's firing a hypersonic missile towards you, and that's traveling at 5 times the speed of sound, you've got 20 seconds between acquiring that target and it killing you. you are, in that situation, going to want to have some form of response that can just deal with that threat. You may be in a different situation where you're doing targeting in a, potentially an area where there may be lots of civilian population. You want to be really measured, you want to be really careful. AI can help you, but you want to make human decision-making has got to take a key role in that. So there are different ways in which it can be applied. But I think as we think through what we do, the ethical side of it, the transparency of it, the assured solutions, and importantly, the adaptive nature of AI is really important. And by adaptive, I mean, the battlefield is changing all the time. You don't just deploy a solution and it works and it's going to work the same every day. You've got to adapt it all the time. You've got to retrain it, make sure it's dealing with the current threats. If it's not working properly, make sure it's tested and changed. So creating adaptive solutions, I think, is hugely important. And that's what we've set the company up to do. That's what we're trying to do. We're 3 years old. We've got a German company that was set up 3 years ago. I set up the UK company 2.5 years ago, and our French business was set up about 18 months ago. We were the only defence company that was invited to the AI Safety Forum at Bletchley Park 2 weeks ago. So that shows that we're starting to have an impact in that space.
Amazing. What about you, Rob?
Thanks, Lynn. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. So in our company, we tend to think about artificial intelligence in a way that really it's anything that we can use data science to replicate a task or activity that to date has been uniquely human. And so what we're trying to replicate in mathematical models are those things that are the essence of humanity. Now, we may not replicate them to the extent that humans can, but when we're talking about things like creativity, knowledge, intelligence, those sorts of things, language, we're now getting to a sophistication of models that we can actually begin to do these things at a speed and over a volume and complexity that a human would struggle with. Now, some of the data challenges Nick was describing sound like my inbox, that I simply can't get through quick enough, I can't read enough, but a model might be able to do that. So in our world, we use various artificial intelligence techniques like natural language processing, knowledge graphs, machine learning, deep learning, to make sense of vast quantities of particularly unstructured modalities. Those modalities are currently very, very well analysed by human researchers, analysts, decision makers, and planners. But those individuals, those humans doing those very, very important tasks for some of the government departments or indeed commercial organisations may simply not have enough time, or they may have particular failings like we've got to sleep at night, or there may not be enough people on the team. So those are the things that we do where we will augment those humans with artificial intelligence software. So we're a software development company that are 130 people based in London, and our software, we call it information intelligence. We help human planners, researchers, and analysts to really make better decisions where better means faster over far greater complexity.
Can I just quickly
Sure, yeah, of course.
on that a little bit? I know you said you wanted a conversation, but as I was listening to that conversation, just something else I think which is worth pointing out. Personally, I'm not that comfortable with the phrase AI. Artificial intelligence. We now have this phrase general artificial intelligence because everybody sees AI to death, so that we now have to make a general statement in front of it to make sure we remember that we don't have artificial intelligence. So we don't have computer intelligence at the moment as we would recognize it in terms of it being an intelligent entity. What we do have in machine learning is an extremely powerful statistical engine, effectively, that ingests large amounts of data, and from that data can make inferences and have insights, which is very difficult for us to write formulas with, right? So we couldn't, I often say this to some of my students, which is, imagine if you observe the world and you come up with Newtonian mechanics, you then have some mathematical formulas which you can feed into a computer, and you can program those computers explicitly to calculate those formulas millions and millions of times without any error. That's, if you like, conventional computing. Now imagine you didn't have Newtonian mechanics and you had not discovered those things in the world, but instead you just fed lots of data about motion of entities and bodies into a machine, and those patterns emerged in such a way that it could make calculations of speed, for example, from distance over time, without you knowing what the formula was, a kind of implicit programming. That's effectively what we have in machine learning. And you can make it more and more complicated just from that simple building block, but that's what we have. Do we have artificial intelligence on the horizon? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But that then poses a whole heap of other ethical questions that we would be interesting to get into.
Now I want to ask, what do you consider to be AI? But maybe we'll pivot to some national security related sort of things. I just want to say I want this to be a conversation, so I'm going to make the panelists talk to each other. and battle with each other. So I want this to be like you guys are at dinner with us. Okay. Okay, so how is machine learning used in national security and defense in the past, and how has that changed into like what we're doing right now? And I'm opening this up to any of the panelists.
Some really exciting, boring things happening.
No, you can't say that.
No, there really are exciting, boring things where, for example, in the US right now, one of the exciting applications is to gather all of our financial data and figure out what we actually put in our budget and what we bought, which seems like a very easy question to answer, but it turns out it's extremely difficult to analyze the US Department of Defense budget. And there's a lot of other, just gathering the data, at least for the US DoD, is hard. We haven't really done it before. The data is not clean. But it is enabling a bunch of back office sorts of tasks that you kind of forget. You think about the military as being bombs and ships and tanks, but there's also an enormous HR problem that the military is dealing with. There are financial officers that need help. So in terms of, I'll start with the very boring, exciting application of AI. There's all the back office tasks that are happening right now.
And it's the boring things where we see the greatest advances in the commercial sector, because a lot of banking is very boring, a lot of the law, insurance. But that's where we're seeing the greatest commercial developments in AI, because there's been a clear demand signal set by those corporates to the developers of those capabilities, and we've seen over a decade now of development. Some of the challenges I'm sure we'll get to in a bit in this talk will be the demand signals maybe haven't been set as clearly by our national security and defence organisations, because some of the things those organisations do are right on the edge of what society actually can imagine, and certainly what software development companies and data scientists can imagine. I'll talk about what I wished we had and some of the early things. So back in 2004, when I was serving in Iraq, we were missing things in our data, and it was really frustrating to the point of quite deep upset that we knew that we didn't have enough time or people to analyze the things that we knew we had access to. And we would get to these problems almost on a daily basis, where we'd get to that wonderful perspective of hindsight, going, God, we could have done something about something that we had missed 6 weeks ago. And it was becoming almost criminal that we were missing these things, but we just didn't have the human processing power. That was a machine problem. It was technically possible to have spotted some of these connections, but for a humanly impossible in the time we had. So there were particular instances around things like hostage rescues of British nationals, quite pertinent at the moment, where a machine could have done a faster job and helped a human get to a particular targeting decision much quicker. So during the early 2000s, we started experimenting with things like entity resolution, entity extraction, use of semantic graphs, all really relevant technologies, but they weren't sufficiently sophisticated to put into a production intelligence system. And that's now where I think is the exciting point we've got to, is that these are much more readily accessible, much more buildable, integratable within systems, and usable by non-data scientists, non-software developers. And so that's really, I think, the kind of era we're now hitting, is we're now able to package these things up, these individual models, into complex intelligence systems to be used as software by, dare I say it, sort of, other experts in their particular job to help them do their jobs better.
That's what Adarga does, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The barrier to entry is probably one of the things that's changed most significantly over the last sort of eight to 10 years. In terms of novel application areas, I think the point is really well made that defense and security domains share the same problems that many other organizations face in terms of their internal operations. And so machine learning having an impact on efficiency, on internal operations and ways of working, we're probably only just seeing the beginning of that, if I'm honest with you. I actually think there's a lot more low-hanging fruit there than is actually taken. And that's probably one of the areas which requires a bit more acceleration. But then, of course, you've seen the use of machine learning in physical systems to drive autonomy, and that's already been done. That's moving forward at pace in some places. And then the whole cyber element, where we're looking at machine learning agents for cyber attack and cyber defense. And when you consider the world as a cyber physical system, where there's physical entities and cyber systems working together, then really it's this rich interplay of this cyber physical world where you're really going to see machine learning play a more and more dominant role. I will just name check a 1948 book, which I think most people should check out if they're interested in this whole field. And that is a book by a guy called Norbert Wiener. I always talk about this book. It's called Cybernetics, and it is about the control and command between the human and the machine. And I don't actually believe we're in a situation, just to sort of counter a little bit, I think, one of Nick's points earlier on, I'm not sure it'll be too sustainable for us to always envisage having a human somehow checking what the machine will be doing. More importantly, we're going to have to figure out how to collaborate with our machines and to be able to pass off whole decisions to those machines where we won't have a say, where we won't necessarily be able to look into things. And that means that those machines have to be trained in such a manner that they carry our values and our aspirations and our aims within them. And that is a massive challenge. Because if we get that wrong and we put bias into those systems and they then go off and do things that we did not intend them to do, then we're going to have a crisis. And I think it's a little bit, it's potentially kind of, I think it's nice to think that we might be able to check all of those things, but in reality, we're already far away from that if you look in different other domains.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, and that is the way the future should look. But you've got a range of options in terms of how you're deploying that activity, in terms of how you do that, I think, is the point I was trying to make. We are very much, though, to Deeph's earlier point, we are at the impact end of some of these applications, and there are some genuine, significant capability enhancements. We only work in areas where we think can get a minimum of a 10 times capability gain, a minimum, and we're finding that is happening across all areas where there is lots of data to be used. So sonar, electronic warfare. Without going into too much detail, we've been heavily engaged in Ukraine over the last 2 years, trying to support them in their existential battle. And without the use of some of these technologies, the mass that they faced would have overwhelmed them, and they have been able to respond to that through the deployment of speed and precision. So one of the things we were doing with them in the early days was they were using satellite imagery to identify how they were going to respond to certain threats from the Russians. But they find it very difficult to use that imagery all year round, especially the electro-optical imagery, because if there's cloud cover, it's difficult to see it. So they use a thing called synthetic aperture radar, which gives them an ability to see through cloud. But it's really difficult to interpret the images you get from that, really difficult. It takes a NATO-trained analyst about 2 years to become proficient in doing that. And they just don't have those people. So they asked if we could help with some software solutions to that, analytic tools to that. And it took our team 3 months to come up with a software solution that gave them the same levels of accuracy as a NATO-trained operator who'd spent 2 years training at 60 times the speed, 60. And what that meant was not only could they do more with less, but actually it changed the dynamic of how that information could be used, because that type of satellite data is traditionally what's called strategic intelligence. It takes days for it to filter around in terms of shaping the decisions that are made. But now they're using it in real time almost, using that to fuse with information they're getting from battlefield systems and being able to have a much more integrated picture of how they respond to that. Yeah, that's a massive change to the way that we've used intelligence before and will continue to be so. And there's lots of other examples of that, frontline impactful use of technology.
I think I would the one thing that in our conversation hasn't come up yet are things like drone swarms. So the ability to have a bunch of different kinds of systems working together towards a common goal. You still have to work out a lot of intention problems, but swarm systems seem to be one of the big new things, not necessarily demonstrated in Ukraine, but this is where the US Replicator Initiative is headed. So we talked about that. I think the other one we didn't talk about yet was the disinformation sort of piece of this, which is more of a defensive kind of a application. And then, so I think those are the only ones that maybe.
That's a massive area.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just talking about that to another panel a few weeks ago. Quite a few years ago, I was on a similar sort of discussion to this, smaller community, and we were talking about the fact that it would be very difficult to differentiate between truth and fiction, and in fact that this would be an enormous challenge for our security and defense-related problems. And I remember a couple of people in the audience at that time who worked in the field were sort of a bit dismissive of it, and saying, well, no, we're pretty good at it. I don't think we've not even scratched the surface of that yet. I mean, what you've seen with ChatGPT, etc., and large language models has surprised even some people who work in that research space themselves. But now you've got the ability to synthesize text and speech and video to a level where it becomes extremely challenging within the time windows for decision that you need to make to differentiate whether it is true or false. It becomes very challenging to be able to do that. And if you really think about it, that in what it can do in terms of shaping action and intent is extremely powerful, and is one of the key reasons why something like the AI Safety Summit, or that whole idea of ethics and safety, really has to be seriously taken.
In your company, Adarga, you deal with information. How do you deal with what Deeph just mentioned between fact and fiction?
I mean, a lot of what Deeph is saying is actually driving the imperative for greater innovation and adoption, of course, because some of these things are being conducted at such a machine speed that a human doesn't. Disinformation is not new. I mean, elections have been manipulated for history. We're just finding very, very efficient tools to do it even more effectively. That's the worrying thing. So there is a counter. We're going to have to start developing models which maybe can identify some of these things, but there are certain things we cannot do at the moment, right? So we cannot. Certainly when you're treating information, I mean, this is more of a personal philosophical belief. I believe there's very, very little real disinformation. Every bit of information has a purpose. So when a particular state or entity or actor is putting something that is a falsehood, that we know to be a falsehood, into an information environment, they're doing it for a reason. Okay, so there's a very sort of positive deliberation on this. And so identifying some of these things, maybe you need to bring in the disinformation, the false, into an information environment in order to start making sense of why they're wanting to do something. That gets really complex. And so there are just certain things we cannot do at the moment. But you can start to identify themes and narratives. That's one thing some of these models are able to do. So one could, for example, you could take a particular subject, a view on an event. So something happens. A graph, for example, can map out, if you've got good extractions of themes, you can show different states' views on a particular event. So you could take a particular event and go, well, show me the American view on something, show me the British view, show me the French view, show me the Russian view. And they're going to be different because they're going to be clustered in different ways. In that particular scenario, though, I'd want a human then being able to deliberate what each of those different views meant. But in time, we're going to have a model that's going to be able to say, well, here are maybe some of the precursors, some of the seeds as to why those views have been taken.
Yeah, and I think there's another layer of concern which I have on this now, which is I think we're at the point at which, well, we've passed the point at which we could even have machines generate the news themselves from what they can actually see statistically that's out there. Now, of course, if you're then going to use news generation agents to just push out information without any real human input or any human activity involved in there, and that again is driven by bias in what is driven in the news, you can end up with misinformation or disinformation which is passed around, which has no real human attribution. Right? It's just coming out from this kind of engine of news, if you like, based on the historical bias that it's already seen. And now without that attribution, what happens when we maybe take action against a piece of information that we suddenly see? And I think that's a really risky security situation that we're tending to find ourselves in. And it comes right the way back to making sure, as I said before, that we're very careful with how we train these algorithms, what kind of information we put in. And the bias problem, making sure that we can correct for bias in the data, I think is very important.
But at least there's recognition that that is a problem. Because I don't think, it wasn't very long ago that it wasn't.
I agree.
Yeah, everybody was just sort of rounding up the horses and going hell for leather. But yeah, it now is understood, and there are techniques and there are responses to that if we sort of think about them and we actually put the time and effort in to respond. So I'm much more hopeful we'll get to that position now.
Well, I also think what's interesting, and I've noticed this a little bit, where in the technical community will go to, hey, we have to look at different ways to look at the bias, and we can. There are technical approaches to things like interpretability or transparency, explainability, but there is a whole field that I think still needs to be worked on, which is education and training for leadership and for military officers to understand. And in the military terms, we typically call this capabilities and limitations. What are the capabilities and limitations? The system is good. I mean, if we go back to satellite imagery, it's really good on a clear day, really bad on a cloudy day. So understanding that with these various algorithms, I can use it for this, I cannot use it for that. There's a lot of training that still has to percolate throughout the force if we want widespread adoption of these tools.
Speaking of disinformation and what's good or bad, what are some ethical considerations you need to have when implementing machine learning in national security and defense?
Well, I think Deep raised it with our values and standards as Western countries. This is really, really important, and we're going to be. I think at one point maybe the controversial point here is we're going to be maybe facing other nations that don't have those same values and standards, and therefore our very systems are going to be opposed to each other. And so if we're putting a human in the mix for certain processes, you may find that adversaries are seeking not to put a human in the mix. And there's a timing competitive challenge there. And we're going to have to get our heads around that as Western militaries.
What's like a tangible example?
So a good example would be the sense time camera network in China. So China is the most surveilled state in the world. I think that's well known. And they are connecting what is effectively facial recognition on CCTV cameras. So, CCTV by its very nature isn't very high resolution. Therefore, the very, if you've ever seen a CCTV camera, you can mistake people on it. If you're using a facial recognition technology on a poor resolution image and you're making automatic arrest decisions off that, that feels to be unethical. That feels to be low precision. That's what they're doing. Would we do that in the UK? Probably not. So there's a mismatch already. And so then, I wouldn't want to be arrested and then to be correctly identified post the arrest because the facial recognition software had got it wrong.
Right.
But that's what's happening in China. And so there's a mismatch on the application of technology and standards.
This is an important point. In fact, I would generalize it even further than that. I would say that organizations and communities of nations who believe they share the same values and standards, the technology is asking the tough question of, do you really, and to what extent? The other question that the technology poses, particularly machine learning and AI, when we start talking about the bias that you're putting in, you have to decide what you'd like to achieve objectively as a human species, right? What are the aims that you'd like to have? The reason why machine learning isn't intelligent is because if we see racism in our data, our values and aspirations tell us that we would like to remove it. The data doesn't tell us that. If we expected the data tells us that racism is a thing to do because it actually exists inside the data set. So human beings have these aspirations and have these values, and then we have to decide, well, how much do we actually care about them in order to direct our machines towards those ends, right? And I think every nation then has to examine that. Clubs of nations have to understand whether or not they really are on the same page, and if they are on the same page, to what extent are they prepared to follow up on that? And that leads to something very, very profound in terms of a defense and security question, which is, what is it that you're actually trying to defend? What is it that you're trying to secure, and what kind of world would you like to see us achieving as humanity? Because there are certain things, by the way, which you can't get around in terms of collaborating or cooperating on. So climate change is happening. It's going to cause problems. There will be conflict. And if there's any single country on the planet who thinks that they can solve climate change on their own, this is just complete craziness, right? It's like saying, well, a human-based system of demarcation on the globe somehow allows us then to solve this wholly interconnected problem. So there's all of these balances that we have to think about very carefully. That I think machine learning in particular forces to ask these questions. And I'm not sure that we always do the best job of sitting back and having that level of introspection. It's starting to happen, but the pace at which things are going frustrates me occasionally because I think perhaps we're not asking those questions quickly enough.
So this was one positive, I think, out of the AI Safety Summit the UK hosted recently, whereby at least there's now a forum to have that broader conversation. Because I think one of the worries I have as a CEO of a tech company is that we're facing probably quite a divergent, fragmented regulatory regime. that worries me from the application of this because not only does it mean I probably can't supply my software to a European nation because there'd be different standards. So I think that sort of that international forum that's one positive that came out of there, a common vocabulary about what we're talking about in terms of key terms, and an ability to convene more than just states.
I'm wholeheartedly in this. I wrote a paper not too long ago, a series of papers that were all called the Inigo Montoya problem. If you've seen The Princess Bride, there's this one phrase where he says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." Yeah. And we analyzed the way that a number of allies use the principles terms. And you can see there are all these little differences that they will use the same high-level phrases, but when you dig down a level, we're not necessarily speaking the same language. And it is forcing this conversation about what is it that you actually want. Define your terms, understand where you're trying to head, and then I think that the companies and the technologists get very frustrated because a policymaker will come out and say, your data, this needs to be explainable. Well, explainable to whom? When, under what circumstances? And so we have to, as the policymaking community, has to do a better job of envisioning what it really wants with the help of the technical community to understand what can actually be done.
Yeah, but therein lies a fundamental problem we've now got because the people who are are leading the drive in this are the commercial companies themselves and not government. So historically, you know, if you've had any new real defence technology developed, it's been developed, you know, funded by militaries, funded by government. Now we're seeing the opposite to that. We're seeing that it's commercial companies who are doing that. So the ethical problem there, certainly for us as a company, is, well, how do we work with government? How do we work to make sure that they understand what it is we can do and how it can be applied in the ways you've described? But also, who do we sell it to? You know, which countries do we sell it to? How do we regulate ourselves in that, or are we going to be regulated to do that? And how does all of that work together in an ethical debate? We've actually set up our own ethics council separately to the company with no, they have no hierarchical sort of oversee from us. They are there to make decisions about how we operate as a commercial entity in this space.
Yeah, we do the same. So my team, even an engineer or a data scientist, can go above me to my chair to say that a decision the company has made anywhere in the company is unethical or irresponsible.
Well, and it comes back to something you said earlier on. This is also coupled to the problem of not having enough technical literacy amongst our decision-making groups and our policy-making domains to actually be able to understand and differentiate the art of the possible from what isn't, what may be coming over the horizon, what good policy making might look like, which is friendly for industry or facilitated for industry, and you know where things may need to be put under more control. And in that kind of sort of difficult situation, you can end up with policy making which kind of ends up, you know, stifling innovation in some cases, or you can just have people saying, well, I don't want to touch it at all because if I touch it, I'll mess it up, and therefore I should just leave it unfettered to run and see where it goes. And neither of those two situations are really ideal. And I think, you know, what Nick was just saying there about what they're doing in their company, which is to try to proactively engage, that's great, because the one thing we don't end up talking about in these debates, we often get into this nation-state thing, but actually a bigger question may well be the nation-state versus the multinational, right? Yeah. And really, isn't there an interesting question there to ask about the balance of power between those two entities, or those two realms, really? Because at the moment, as you say, the real understanding of capability and all of the other different things lies at the moment probably inside the private sector compared to what it does in nation states on a general basis.
And I don't think just the moment. I think that is now a fundamental change in the way in which this is going, because I just don't see how, you know, old-fashioned defence companies, I say old-fashioned in a very pejorative way, who only spend 2% of their R&D on this type of technology are going to be able to keep pace. And I don't see how governments will attract the people who can actually do this. So I think certainly for the next 10, 20 years, it's going to be a case where it is the private sector who are driving this in many ways. So that's a really tangible issue we've got to face and work with. You know, just look at, you know, Starlink's withdrawn by a certain individual, and, you know, just on the whim.
Could you explain it for some people in the audience who don't?
Yes, so Starlink provided by Elon Musk, you know, a system which has been used widely in Ukraine to enable communications to happen across that space. If he felt that there was something going on that he didn't agree with, he could turn that off, and has, you know, threatened to do so. I mean, that is a really...
I think he actually did it.
He did.
So
Yeah,
there was this really revealing Washington Post article, I think it was the Post, that where the Ignatius, I guess, was describing that Musk gets a call basically in the middle of the night that says, oh my goodness, the Ukrainians are about to launch an attack on Crimea, and he determines that he shall shut down Starlink so that they cannot complete that attack, because he, under his theory of deterrence, is trying to prevent World War III. Now, I don't know if he's right or not, but I think it is a really important question about whether or not that event should have occurred, and that private companies have that kind of ability. And to take, I think, this whole issue one step further, is there are defense companies that are very familiar with these kinds of dilemmas, and they are contracted typically by governments. But Starlink and Microsoft and Amazon and Clearview AI and Primer AI and other companies took action in Ukraine not under a government contract. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do and because the government wasn't moving fast enough. But that's a new realm. We are used to contracts. We understand how those work. We have got a state system, but when these companies decide to do it for what they are, if you look at the satellite companies like Maxar or Capella Space, they list this as data philanthropy and ESG, and they're in a conflict. And that's a really big change that I don't think all of us have sorted out yet.
No, it's not. And we are doing that ourselves. But we're doing that because of the speed of response of international governments is so slow. The pace of being able to make decisions is so slow, and that's a fundamental thing that will need to change.
I think this is what, certainly what we're trying to do with the Diana project is to try and make sure that the next generation of startups who work in this space, who are developing technologies, have a much closer understanding of the problem space with decision makers, with policy makers, with government, and with academia and industry. This kind of this triplet is actually talking in a lot more of an iterative and high frequency manner with one another. So in fact, there's a lot closer understanding. Because I think what you end up with is actually quite a drift between, let's say, those three entities of academia, industry, and government. They end up kind of, entrenched in their own areas and occasionally talk to one another. And that maybe would have worked 30, 40 years ago. But the reality of the situation now with things moving in such a dynamic way is that if you've got one element of that doesn't quite understand what's going on with the others, then in fact you risk ending up in quite a bad situation. I don't, by the way, think that the situation with Starlink highlights a problem which has been going on for quite some time in different ways. It's not that the private sector hasn't been able to affect that kind of influence on things that I think people should have had more of a say in. It's just that in this case it became very, very obvious, and modern technology means it's more and more impactful, I think, for someone like him to have that impact. Certainly something that we need to be able to watch, because you have to ask yourself, are any of these entities elected?
Yeah.
Do we care that they are elected or not elected to be able to make those kind of decisions? Being perfectly objective here, this audience might think they don't really care. But then, that changes the game in society, doesn't it, quite fundamentally?
But at the heart of this is an intimacy problem. Traditionally, defence has existed behind barbed wire fences. It's been a very separate world. The defence industry has been a very separate industry, fighter jet manufacturing. This now needs an intimate partnership between all aspects of society, not just industry and defence, but also academia, and we've hit upon it. Educating our decision makers, our policy makers, our military commanders is going to require that intimate partnership, and it's not a case of turning up and doing a briefing or doing a panel like this. It's going to have to be a 24/7 activity where understanding is constant. Because if you put some numbers on this, it's no surprise to me that the government innovates slower than industry now. If you think about the British government spends approximately £14 billion a year on R&D, 14 billion. Defence spends about 1.8. One investment bank, JP Morgan, spends 15. Amazon spent 40. The whole of the finance and investment sector spends 650. No wonder banks are ahead, right? No wonder banks have got better software, better infrastructure. And so how do you take some of that learning that's happening in the private sector and translate it into government use? And it's not just defence, it's across every single aspect of government. We'd all love our governments to be more efficient, spend less money, use less people, make quicker decisions. So it's across the board, and those lines are super blurred now, and everyone, certainly in this room, has a responsibility to help educate and understand.
What are just some more examples of dual use technologies, just so there's like a baseline?
Drones.
Okay.
I think the Ukraine drone example is interesting because I just came from a conference in Warsaw where I had a warfighter say, first he said, don't give me any of that AI nonsense, which I thought was pretty interesting as a warfighter reaction. And then he said, I just want DJI drones. So DJI drones are these, if you're a drone enthusiast, you probably have one, but they're widely available, excellent, great cameras, easy to fly, great for your wedding videography. So lots of uses for hobbyists, but they were weaponized in Ukraine very effectively. Ukrainians were really innovative, and now I think it's getting harder and they're not as well suited to electronic warfare, but that's an example of something that you can use for your wedding videography is also useful on a battlefield, or at least it was at the beginning.
Well, we just finished our first call over the summer for 3 research domains for startups. We're just about to put the first cohort of companies on contract in the next month. We had energy resilience, sensing and surveillance in challenging environments, and the communication of information in sort of denied or challenging environments. All 3 of those areas have huge dual-use applications. So if you think of the sensing and surveillance domain, for example, understanding more about our oceans and being able to monitor and look at our oceans in real time with greater data sets enables us to huge number of things around making sure that we have environmental protection data in place, and also mitigate ongoing criminal activity like illicit fishing, for example, whilst at the same time that same technology can be hugely beneficial for the Navy in tactical operations, but also in preliminary operations, making sure that, as I said before, you don't get into conflict in the first place. Energy resilience, another perfect example. You know, on the battlefield or in times of conflict or even in just general disaster locations, you're energy denied. So any technology which can enable people to have energy and create redundancy, if you like, in such difficult circumstances is wonderful in, let's say, in a more traditional defense context. But then in a smart city and an urban infrastructure, the same technology is hugely applicable in making sure that civil society is more resilient, and in fact that we can put out energy grids in difficult to reach places. So there are a myriad of different examples that when you really start thinking about it, there are things that we can develop which have these dual purposes. And more importantly, when those dual purposes mean that one of the principal purposes means that, in fact, we create more prosperous, resilient societies, because that goes back to what I said earlier on. That's hitting the root cause of insecurity in the first place. You know, we need to make sure that the actual reasons for going to war are minimized. I'm not saying we're going to eliminate them in the short term, but they certainly have to be minimized. We cannot be solving all of the problems that we're going to face in the next few decades by going to war. This is a bizarre proposition for humanity, and it's something that we really have to start thinking about now, particularly in the face of things like machine learning and AI, because, as I said previously, they can help us to move the dial in a much more positive direction than we've gone already, but they can also make things a lot worse. You know, this is a human agency issue, as I said.
But I love that positivity, Deeph, in terms of, you know, everybody talks about dual-use technology in terms of weaponizing, you know, sort of civilian tech. Well, actually, yeah, there's much more opportunity there from developments in the defence space to be taken into those really difficult challenges that we face in climate change and lots of other areas, because the defence challenges are the most difficult ones. So if you're trying to solve autonomous driving, at least when an autonomous vehicle comes to a traffic light, that traffic light is trying to tell us it's red or green. In the military space, somebody's trying to spoof it, or it was blown up, you know, 2 hours ago. So the challenges you're facing, you know, if you can solve them, the applicability of taking those into the civilian domain is massive. There's so much opportunity there.
This conversation is amazing, but I know that the audience is dying to ask questions, so I'll open up the floor for questions. Yes, you. Sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, the one that's looking around frantically. Sorry, I will ask you second, okay? Yeah. Could you stand up and just, you know, say who you are and what your background is?
Paul Skinner. I'm just here in a personal capacity. I run something called Marketing Kind. But I actually wanted to pick up on Deeph's last comments and ask the panel, in an environment of cognitive warfare, how do you see, or do you see, the relationship changing between national security and the broader resilience of a population? You know, for example, does a deterioration in public services and national discourse in recent years leave us more exposed to security threats?
Happy to dive in. Absolutely. Those lines are completely blurred, more than they ever have been, right? So when we really think about sort of grand strategy and what it means to win, or rather, probably the easiest way to think about it is how do we not lose in a general strategic sense. Only part of that is what we'd imagine as traditional defence and security activity. And I think we've felt this through COVID, right? You know, homeland resilience, safety, security of our population, our society becomes the most fundamental thing, and that's not a great deal to do with tanks. So when information, misinformation, actually becomes at the heart of undermining a population of society, then it's the responsibility of all departments. And we're not set up, as any of our governments yet, to really understand those complex issues. We don't come together, I'll talk on behalf of the UK in particular, we don't come together particularly effectively in some of those crisis scenarios. You know, COVID was a great example, right? It wasn't just impacting the NHS, although that was the kind of lead department for it. So maybe structures such as our cabinet need to then find greater capability to maybe convene some of those. But when we think about, and Deep really touched on this, this is at the heart of strategic competition in our modern age. Those nations that are able to innovate faster than adversaries will reap the dividends that come from the productivity, the prosperity, and be able to have safer, secure nations. So there's a much broader new nation of statehood, if I dare, where technology is concerned. Because if the UK, the US, other countries can innovate to the benefit of all, we have loads of wonderful software companies or loads of wonderful self-driving car companies, and we're all employed because of it, these wonderful technologies, then by our very nature, we're hopefully more prosperous, our nations will become more secure. And so there's a very, very deep connection now between strategic success and national security and technology.
Next question, sir. I promised you could ask.
In the context of global AI development and national security concerns, how can organizations across various countries ensure compliance with internationally recognized standards for AI systems before public release? And what I'm alluding to is this is a U.S.-centric lens, but the legislation, the executive order that came out just last week mandating that any AI model be submitted to the U.S. government for review and assurance of certain compliance with NIST-defined standards before public release. So curious what your reactions are to that kind of regulatory paradigm and how we can ensure the competitive landscape isn't stifled for smaller companies as those kinds of safeguards are introduced.
I will attempt to wander into that one as the resident American. Well, one of the.
Hey.
So Lillian, you can back me up. That's a 110-page executive order that he's referring to that came out 2 weeks ago, a week ago, at the same time as the UK AI Summit, at the same time, I think, as the Hiroshima process. And there's a lot that's happened in AI in the past 2 weeks. So let me tell you first that I don't think the answer on kind of I don't think they've fully fleshed out what level of, like what the parameters are going to be. I think there's a piece in there, but it's not entirely clear to whom this is going to apply. It certainly fits into the debate that is going on, and I think I heard a little bit earlier today about regulatory capture and whether or not the really big vendors, the famous ones that I won't go by name, are looking for that kind of a regulation because they can meet it, whereas others may not. But I think we will see a lot of debate over the next 120 days because we've got really aggressive timelines inside of that executive order. It's all basically before the next election.
Yep.
And we're going to have to figure out some of those definitions. I don't think we know exactly what it means. I don't think anybody really knows. I think the fight in the U.S. will be around defining those terms a bit further. Sorry if that's not a full answer.
Yes, sir. In the glasses. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Madhu Raghunath. I'm an investment banker since I left the spires of Oxford many years ago. So I'm well familiar with smoke, mirrors, volatility, making money from all of that, and also, of course, bypassing moral hazard. But I guess my question is that, with the executive order and all these various conferences, and I'm doing a degree in Cambridge on AI ethics. And again, that doesn't come naturally to bankers. So. Nonetheless, my question is that, are you worried that national security gives you a license to basically bypass any form of ethical standard that you and I set for civilians? So we can talk about privacy, and then we say, well, who cares about privacy? I've got an epidemic. Yeah. Who cares about privacy, or who cares about explainability when I'm getting rockets fired at me?
I might take that up, actually.
I'd love to follow up on that one.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, actually, because what it goes back to is what we talked about a little while ago, which is how much do you actually care about those value statements you make? The value statements you make are really only any good, or as good as when they're first tested, right, to the extreme. So you're absolutely right. If you suddenly end up in a crisis situation of one form or the other, let's say it's a pandemic, or let's say you're suddenly worried about a competitor getting better at something than you are, and at that very first moment of testing of that value statement, you decide to go back on it and actually relax it for just this one time because we're in a crisis, then I think that's a really rather slippery slope. And this is the kind of non-strategic thinking that we've got going on when we do set these value statements up, right? And in one way to luxury when things are going well to make those value statements. It's a question of mental exercise to really test those when you do make them, to say, well, look, if this then happens, am I really going to stand by them? And I think, unfortunately, quite often, certainly in liberal democracies, we've seen in recent times people starting to make statements about kind of reneging on those things. Now, I find that very, very frightening, because I feel it's harder to sell a story of being disingenuous to a population than it is to sell a story of consistency. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, if I'm a dictator and I just tell you I'm a dictator and I just go ahead and do it, that can be seen as a more trustworthy position than me saying, well, actually, here's my really high value statement, and then the next minute a crisis hits and I say, well, actually, I didn't believe it so much in the first place. So we do have to think about that extremely carefully, and machine learning and AI and data-driven technologies pose precisely that challenge and that problem. And we've not always done the best in being able to deal with that, and COVID was a fantastic example of that. So yeah, I think it's certainly an issue. You ask whether defense and security has that particular problem, but I would say that finance has had that problem for a very long time. And the question you could pose in an opposite way is, does the need to drive for profit also allow you to say, well, actually, I don't necessarily need to operate the way my state says I should operate where I'm incorporated, because I'm now operating in a different legal jurisdiction? The answer to that question over the last few decades has been, yeah, I can pretty much do what I want to do over here as long as I fit those rules, but the rules at home can be slightly different. We can't really continue that way in this very interconnected world. It turns out, I think that's an unsustainable proposition.
If I may, your question implies that there are zero checks and balances or regulation or policies or laws for armed conflict. Having been a soldier for 10 years, having been a banker for 10 years, there are far more moral considerations, policies, procedures, checks and balances in defence and national security than anywhere near investment banking or many other parts of free society.
But I mean, it's a general problem, right? I think that's the reason I think your question is so good, because it actually, when you start examining many of the things that we do, you could argue that we're not as consistent as maybe we should be.
And I think the details are, as you said, like once you really test these and push them and put yourself in really uncomfortable positions, which you have to do in defense, then you do start to enumerate and elaborate. So the first US DoD, so to your point, the EO does not have a bunch in it for those interested in national security. I also read the EO and thought, where's all the national security stuff? And then I remembered, wait a second, we made our AI officers back in 2012. Our first autonomous AI policy came out in 2012. We redid it in 2018. We did another one in 2021. We have the Department of Defense ethical AI principles that were put out by the DepSecDef. We have the CDAO that just put out a new AI strategy. So in fact, US DoD, has been like very concerned about working through all of our principles, command and control, rules of war, all of these things have been trying to work through. And it is, I'm not going to say we nail it every time. It is a very difficult question, but it is absolutely one that is asked often.
But we've also got to hold our politicians more to account. I mean, is the other thing, and I'm not sure we always do. You know, I think COVID is now really, as we sit here in the UK and look at the COVID inquiry and just listen to how decisions were made within government. You know, there were some really interesting things going on. So how do we gain more control over that decision making in a way that allows the sorts of challenges you've got to be faced as well with confidence? Because I'm not totally confident that even if we have the right rules and procedures in place, I know that the army and the army decision makers will want to follow those in the way they always have done. But I'm not sure our politicians necessarily do.
And just a very quick thing on this. So you made me think of something else there, Nick. This shouldn't be viewed as sort of moralizing, right? There's a very practical reason for making this consideration right now, going back to the topic of this forum right now, and that's the idea of machine learning and data-driven technologies. The details, shall we say, the implementation details around some of these value statements, perhaps in the past, didn't matter so much, okay? Because there was no real kind of scale-up ramification for some of this stuff. It could be enclaved, it could be regionalized, whatever you like. In a hyper-connected, interconnected world where everything is linked up together and machine learning is driven by the data and that information, suddenly those details of implementation become very real and important, because those agents are going to take actions in the world, and it comes right back to what we said before. How are we then going to formulate agents that do the kind of things we want to see in the world? So this is a very practical reason for addressing this, not just some kind of philosophical, moral argument that we can sit back on. And I think that's the thing that's really changed in the last 15 to 20 years, is the technology forces us to consider this in a very practical sense.
I'm very sorry, but this is all the time that we have. But we will have, the rest of the afternoon that you can ask the speakers questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's give our hand for the speakers.